Each year, thousands of crimes that were committed go unsolved, and in some cases they take years to solve. Some have left investigators baffled for decades, but as crime-fighting technology advances, ever more of these cases are finally brought to a close, and 2024 was no different. Number 10. In 1981, 51-year-old John Blaylock was a father of 3 and employed as a steelworker in Griffith, Indiana. On the morning of November 3rd, Blaylock didn't show up for his shift and his coworkers became concerned. 2 of his coworkers traveled to his apartment to check on him, but they were not prepared for what they found when they arrived. Upon entering the apartment, they found him deceased in his bedroom and undressed from the waist down. The police were called and they started processing the crime scene and quickly determined that an altercation had taken place and that Blaylock had been hit with an alarm clock and a piece of pottery. Both of these items were found shattered on the ground close to Blaylock, along with his watch that had been damaged during the struggle and stopped at 2:15 a.m. 2 days earlier. The rest of the apartment also contained some clues. Biological material was found in several areas, including a china cabinet in the hallway, a different cabinet in the living room, a jacket that was left draped over a chair, the sink in the bathroom, a towel, and in several areas in Blaylock's bedroom where his body was discovered. A homicide investigation was started, and investigators decided to speak to Blaylock's sons to hear if they knew of anyone that may want to harm him. They explained that he used to spend time at a bar called John's Place. A barman at the bar stated that he last saw Blaylock on the 1st of November, the day that his watch stopped, and that he was in the company of a man who hadn't been to the bar before, at least not to his knowledge. He was able to give a description of the man, stating that he was of a medium build, stood about 5 foot 8 inches tall, and that he had dirty blonde hair with what he described as dark eyes. The case was handed to Detective John Mowry Sr., but no further clues were found, and since DNA technology wasn't an option back then, the case went cold. But in 2018, the case drew the attention of Mowry's son, John Jr., and he decided to take another look at the details. After scouring through the crime scene photos that were taken that day, he concluded that Blaylock could not have been present in the areas where biological material was found, since he would have been too badly injured. That meant that his attacker had likely also sustained an injury during the altercation, and that at least some of the biological material belonged to that person. Swabs that had been taken in the bathroom at the time were sent for DNA analysis, but no one was identified since the attacker's DNA wasn't in the database. But when the samples were sent to Parabon Nanolabs, it was determined that the DNA belonged to one of 3 people from the same family. One of the 3 was tracked down and a hair sample was collected, but that person was ruled out since it didn't match the sample. The second family member was tracked down and approached during a traffic stop. Officers collected a cigarette butt from the car and sent that to be tested, which resulted in that person also being ruled out. This left one more person to be tested, who by process of elimination had to be the one that attacked Blaylock. That person was 64-year-old Gregory Thurston, who was living in Eugene, Oregon. Thurston already had a history with the law since he had warrants out for battery, but when he was located back then, Indiana didn't even get him because they felt it was too far away. On the 24th of October, 2024 though, Eugene police officers tracked him down once more and he was taken into custody. He was surprised to learn of the new developments in Blaylock's case and is currently awaiting trial in Lake County after being charged with murder. Number 9. These days, hitchhiking is seen as a very risky way to get around. But in the 1960s and 70s, it was commonplace to see people of all ages standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. One such person was 25-year-old Mary Kathleen Schay, who hailed from Minneapolis. The case started on the 15th of February, 1974, when Mary was found deceased by the side of the road in Springbrook, Wisconsin. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and it was then revealed that she'd been hitchhiking to an art show in Chicago when she was last seen alive. Only one clue was found at the scene, a discarded stocking cap. This allowed investigators to build a partial profile of Mary's attacker, but with no further clues to go by, the case inevitably went cold for decades. In 2023, investigative genetic genealogy investigators David Gurney and Karen Binder decided to re-examine the case and DNA that was collected from the stocking cap that had been left behind at the scene of the crime. They also started looking for possible relatives of the owner of the DNA, using the ancestry sites GED Match Pro and Family Tree DNA. They started making some inroads into the investigation and interviewed people in Wyoming, Michigan, and Minnesota, where they tracked down a man named John K. Miller, who was now 84 years old. It had taken over 12 months to get to this point, but considering that the case was already several decades old, the effort was well worth it. Investigators would later reveal that the process took much longer than usual, since Miller was adopted as a child. As soon as Miller was confronted with the evidence against him, he confessed that he was the one who ended Mary's life that day. In fact, as soon as he opened his door and saw officers standing there, he knew that his time on the run had finally come to an end. Kevin Bigg from the Dunn County Sheriff's Office stated that this was the first time that they'd solved the case using genetic genealogy, and that they saw this as a massive victory for the agency. He added that the case had been reviewed many times over the decades that had passed since Mary was found, and some leads had been received, but they never led anywhere, and no suspects were ever identified. Mary's family was informed that Miller had been identified as Mary's killer, and that he'd been taken into custody, to which they expressed their gratitude and relief that they were finally able to get some answers and closure. The sheriff stated that he believes Miller was relieved to have finally been caught, since he'd been looking over his shoulder for the last 50 years, waiting for the law to close in on him. He added that Miller was calm under interrogation and willingly admitted to the crime. Number 8. 69-year-old ELR Rann, known to his friends and family as Bud, served in the Vietnam War and was one of the lucky soldiers who returned home safely. Once back in the US, he bought himself a 1966 Ford Mustang, and it quickly became his pride and joy. But somewhere along the line, Bud and the car parted ways, but he always hoped to find another. And in January of 2015, he posted an ad on Craigslist while living in Atlanta, Georgia, asking if anyone had one for sale. He didn't have to wait long before he got a reply. A man responded stating that he'd seen one for sale in South Georgia and that Bud could come and view it in the town of McRae. He was elated at the news, and together he and his 66-year-old wife, June, traveled to McRae in their GMC Envoy, a trip that would see them travel 180 miles to see the car. But Bud and June never returned from the trip, and they were reported as missing. A land and water search was conducted, and investigators asked residents of the area if they'd seen the couple or anyone suspicious, but they received no leads. A few days later, someone stumbled upon their bodies in a wooded area in Telfair County. Their GMC Envoy was found in a lake in the same area, and it quickly became apparent that they'd been lured there by someone with nefarious intentions. Their autopsies revealed that they'd been attacked with a firearm and that their lives had been ended quickly. Upon hearing that the couple had traveled to the area to look at a vehicle, investigators tracked down the man who had responded to Bud's Craigslist ad. The man, Ronnie Adrian Towns, was taken into custody after his father convinced him to hand himself over. He was removed from the woods where he was hiding out and charged with 2 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty, but the case saw several delays. On one occasion, because too few jury members had shown up to court, and almost a decade later he'd not stood trial yet. He remained adamant that he had nothing to do with the crime, repeatedly telling his father that he was innocent. On the 14th of April, 2024, a man whose name has not been made public was magnet fishing in Horse Creek and came across a few surprising objects. His magnet latched onto a .22 caliber firearm, and he immediately informed the police. The same man went back to Horse Creek again 2 days later, and this time he found a bag containing a cell phone, credit cards, and driver's licenses, all of which belonged to Bud and June. With this new evidence being found, they secured a search warrant for Towns' house, and there they gathered even more evidence, though investigators declined to mention what evidence they had found. Confronted with these new pieces of evidence, Towns knew that his long stint of running from the law had come to an end, and he decided to change his plea to guilty. The prosecution sought the death penalty, but Towns was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 7. The murder of 75-year-old Louisa Dunn took place in Bristol, England in 1967. And her case remained unsolved for 57 years, making it the oldest case in Avon and Somerset Police's history. Dunn was born in either 1891 or 92 and was married twice, but both of her husbands passed away. At one point, she was married to Teddy Parker, who was a city councilor, and she was slated to become the mayor of Bristol. But that opportunity fell away when Teddy passed away. When her second husband, John Dunn, who worked as a night watchman, passed away, it had a profound effect on her, and by all accounts, she retreated into solitude, becoming somewhat of a recluse. Then, on the 28th of June, 1967, Louisa's neighbor arrived at her house and stumbled on a horrific scene. They found Louisa deceased on her living room floor, and it was determined that someone had ended her life via strangulation. The resulting investigation didn't uncover any additional clues, and no witnesses came forward, leaving Louisa's attacker's identity a mystery. She was well known and liked by the Easton community where she lived, and no one knew of anyone who would want to harm her. It was assumed that she lost her life after someone broke into her home during a robbery, and that she surprised the robber, who then attacked her to avoid being identified and arrested, resulting in her life being ended. For the next 57 years, there'd be no progress in Louisa's case, and it seemed as though her attacker would get away with their heinous crime. Some forensic evidence had been collected from the scene at the time, but it was of no help since the technology to analyze it didn't exist yet. But in 2023, investigators decided to take another look at the case, and that same evidence was sent to a crime lab to be tested. When the results came back, investigators were relieved to learn that there was a positive match and that they finally had a suspect. A man who at the time was in his 30s and was now 92 years old was linked to the scene, and he was questioned. This resulted in his arrest, and a police spokesman stated that the investigation is still ongoing, but that the case would be brought to a close soon. The man's name was not immediately made public, but it was thought that he was well known in Bristol, since investigators stated that his arrest would come as quite a shock to the surrounding community. He was later identified as Ryland Headley, who was living in Ipswich when he was arrested. Headley had been charged with ending Louisa's life and appeared virtually before the Bristol Magistrates Court. His trial will, however, take place at the Bristol Crown Court, and he'll learn his fate for the crime that he committed almost 6 decades ago. Number 6. When someone goes missing and is never seen again, there's usually some speculation that they were a victim of foul play, and that their life had been ended. In some cases, they're found many years later, and investigators are able to make some progress, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes the missing person is found much later when they're linked to a John or Jane Doe case, where someone was found deceased but never identified. But this was what happened in the case of a woman whose remains were found long ago, and whose case was featured on the popular show America's Most Wanted. The case started in 1986 when a man was doing some fishing in Lake Pontchartrain, which is situated close to Slidell in Louisiana. He stumbled across a woman's body that was floating in the water, and he immediately contacted the St. Tammany Parish Police. A coroner found that she was a victim of homicide, and that her attacker had ended her life through strangulation, though she was also attacked with a sharpened blade. No one came forward to claim her body, and she didn't fit the description of any missing woman at the time, leaving investigators with very few clues to follow. It was determined that she was between 20 and 30 years old, and a facial reconstruction was performed, and a photo of the result was released to the public, but this didn't jog anyone's memory, and the case quickly went cold. She was given the moniker Lady of the Lake. Investigators revealed that she had auburn hair, freckles, and well-cared-for teeth, since she hadn't had any dental work done, other than having her wisdom teeth removed. Some of her teeth were missing, but it was believed that they were lost while she was in the water. It was also found that she'd suffered a few injuries in the past, the most notable being to her hip, and it was theorized that she'd been in a car accident at some point. She'd also had facial reconstructive surgery done, including rhinoplasty. She was of a slim build and had several scars on her body, including a circular one on her right knee, one on her right wrist, and one on her abdomen, and she was estimated to have stood about 5'3" and 125 pounds. When the case was included on an episode of America's Most Wanted, hopes were high that someone would recognize her and come forward, but unfortunately no further leads were received. Then in 2022, a grant was approved that made it possible for DNA evidence gathered at the scene to be tested, and once again there was hope that the woman would finally be identified, giving authorities the chance to look into the case further. In 2023, these efforts finally paid off. Possible family members of the unknown woman were identified, and they were able to confirm that her name was Pamela Lee Hupp, who had disappeared in 1986, shortly before she was found in the lake. Since investigators noted that she had a ring mark on one of her fingers, it was assumed that she was robbed before her life was ended, but this remains mere speculation. Despite Pamela now finally being identified, though, her attacker's identity remains unknown, but the investigation remains open. Anyone with information on this case is asked to contact their local police or Detective Winston Harbin at 985-276-1355. Number 5. Most people think of Las Vegas as the neon-filled casino-based city that we can see in movies, and while this is mostly true, it also has its dark side, as is evidenced by a case that started in 1994. In August of that year, 2 men were hiking next to Lake Mead Boulevard, close to the lake's recreational area, where they made an unexpected and horrific discovery. They stumbled across the body of a woman near the water and reported it to the police. When investigators arrived, they were perturbed to discover that the woman hadn't lost her life there, but had been dragged to the water's edge by someone who likely attacked her and ended her life. She was eventually identified as 27-year-old Melanie White, and when an autopsy was performed, it was revealed that she'd been struck over the head and then strangled before her body was moved. Her family was informed that she'd been found, and more details then came to the fore. They told the police that Melanie and her boyfriend had moved to Las Vegas in the spring of that year, but she suddenly went missing. They tried on multiple occasions to make contact with her, but were unable to, and they filled out a missing person report. They also revealed that at the time she was struggling to figure out what to do with her life and that she was at a crossroads, which prompted the move to Las Vegas. It was known that she was making regular trips between Las Vegas and Phoenix, but few clues were found at the crime scene, and her attacker and their motive remained unknown. Weeks turned into months, and eventually years passed without any progress in the case. Some friends that Melanie had made in the city told investigators that they saw her the night before she disappeared, and that she didn't seem in any way distressed. They were shocked to learn that she had not only gone missing, but that she'd been murdered. Her friends and family described her as a very nice person with a very kind nature. She had a son who's now 33 years old, and who grew up never knowing what happened to his mother. But in 2024, all of that changed. Melanie's case was re-examined in 2010, and a DNA profile was entered into the CODIS DNA database, but this didn't immediately result in a suspect being identified. The case went cold once more until 2021, when detectives contacted a group called Vegas Justice League, which aids in bringing cold cases like Melanie's to a close. They sent the collected DNA to Othram Labs, but it wouldn't be until 2024 that anything useful was found. A man called Arthur Lavery was named as a suspect, and when his criminal history was checked, it was found that he'd been arrested for battery once in the past. Melanie's friends then recalled that they last saw her in an area close to where Lavery was living at the time, which was on 15th and Fremont, but they never made the connection that he was her attacker. Unfortunately, Lavery would never face the consequences of his crime, since he contracted COVID in 2021 and passed away. The motive for the crime remains unknown, since it isn't known whether Melanie and Lavery knew each other when the attack occurred. Melanie's family thanked investigators and everyone involved in the investigation for finally providing them with the answers that they'd been looking for decades, and they were relieved to finally have a sense of closure. Number 4. In May of 2021, 49-year-old Leslie Prier was living in Chevy Chase, Maryland, where she worked for an advertising company called Specialties, Inc. But on the morning of the 2nd of May, she failed to show up for her shift at 10 a.m. Her manager, Brett Reedy, contacted Leslie's family and asked them to go to her house to see if she was all right. Reedy and Carl Prier, Leslie's husband, traveled to the house, and when they arrived, they immediately knew something was wrong. They found biological material on the walls by the front door and a puddle of water that had gathered on the floor near the same door. A table in the house was lying on its side, and a rug that was usually in the house's foyer was now in the living room. They noticed that the rug also had biological material on it. They searched the house but couldn't find Leslie anywhere. They called 911, and at around 11:47, the Montgomery County Police Department was notified to do a welfare check at a house on the 4800 block of Drummond Avenue, which they then did. Reedy and Carl were told to wait outside the house until officers could get there, and when they arrived, they found Leslie deceased, and the house was secured as a crime scene since it was quickly determined that she'd been attacked. She was found in a shower stall in the house's upstairs master bathroom, and it was noted that she had injuries to her head. The house was dusted for fingerprints and swabbed for any possible DNA that may have been present, since some of the biological material may have belonged to the attacker. It was also found that whoever committed the crime had tried to clean up before leaving the house, which explained the puddle of water by the front door. The culprit had ended Leslie's life in the foyer before carrying her upstairs to the bathroom, likely to prevent more biological material from spreading. Investigators searched through dumpsters in the area in hopes of finding empty cleaning containers that may have been used by the killer and that may have contained their fingerprints, but nothing was found. A blue lithocrystal process revealed that a lot of biological material had been cleaned up before the attacker fled. Samples were obtained from Carl for comparison, and he was quickly ruled out as a suspect, since the samples collected in the house indicated that they belonged to an unknown male. DNA was recovered from under Leslie's fingernails and was sent to a lab for processing, and it was determined that it belonged to the same man. The DNA was submitted to the CODIS database, but no match was found. Investigators spoke to the couple's neighbors, but no one had seen anyone suspicious in the area that morning or heard anything at the time that the attack took place. One neighbor stated that she saw Carl leaving for work that morning and that he had looked back at the house, presumably while saying goodbye to Leslie. They also interviewed her family and friends, asking if they knew of any men who would want to harm Leslie. These men were then questioned and asked to provide DNA samples, but no matches were found. For the next 23 years, nothing more was found and Leslie's case stalled. But in 2022, the collected DNA was sent to Family Tree DNA's Open Data Personal Genetic Database, and investigators were provided with a last name, Gleiger. It was then discovered that Leslie's daughter once dated a 44-year-old man named Eugene Gleiger, and that he and his mother had moved out of the neighborhood in 2001. His record showed that he'd been in trouble with the law before, since he was found to be in possession of unlicensed firearms, had been pulled over for driving while intoxicated, and had been arrested for theft. Gleiger was placed under surveillance, and in 2024, investigators saw him opening and drinking from a bottle, which he then threw in the trash. They collected the bottle and swabbed it for DNA, resulting in Gleiger being identified as Leslie's attacker. It isn't known why Gleiger attacked Leslie, since he hadn't spoken to her daughter for years, but he's now in custody and is awaiting trial. Number 3. Google Maps is a very useful tool that's become commonplace in our lives in the last few years. It also serves as a source of entertainment in some instances, as people can zoom in on any area they wish in the world to get a better look at it. There are even YouTube channels dedicated to finding strange and sometimes perturbing views on Google Maps, but these usually have a reasonable explanation, such as people pretending to murder victims when the Google Maps car is spotted. This usually happens every year, but some areas are only photographed every 3 years or so, since they may be delayed by bad weather, traffic, or precarious political situations in any particular country or area. But in 2023, such an incident had a very bizarre outcome. In November of that year, a man whose identity has not been made public was reported as missing by one of his family members in Spain, since he received a suspicious text that had been sent from his phone. The message stated that the man had met someone and decided to move to a different part of the country. It also stated he'd be getting rid of his phone, but no further explanation was given. Later on, the man who's described as a 33-year-old from Cuba was found deceased in a cemetery, and it was determined he was the victim of homicide. During the investigation, police officers looked at Google Maps Street View for any clues, and quite unbelievably, they found something. They came across an image of two people loading a large object that was wrapped in cloth into a car in Tenhueco, where they were able to identify the make and model of the car. This then led them to the house of the man's partner, where she was found in the company of her ex. They also found another image of someone moving a large object with the use of a wheelbarrow, and it was believed to be the same victim that was seen in the first photo. All of these leads led investigators to believe that the victim's partner and her ex were responsible for ending his life, after which they tried to hide their crime by transporting him to the cemetery where he was found. They were both arrested, but further details have not been made available, since the case is still under investigation. It isn't known what charges they'll be facing, or what the motive for their crime was, but the Google Maps images will almost certainly be used as evidence against them. Number 2. The murder of 24-year-old Wayne Pratt, which occurred in Winnebago County in 1963, is one that has left investigators without any answers for almost 60 years. But in 2024, a breakthrough was finally made. At the time, Wayne and his wife Marie were living next to the Enco gas station where he worked, and he was in the habit of staying home at night, only walking over to the gas station when someone pulled up for gas. On the night in question, Wayne was doing just that. He'd been watching TV in his house when someone arrived at the station at around 8:40 p.m., and he walked over to tend to his customer. Wayne would usually leave the gas station lights off until he entered, but on this occasion, Marie noticed the lights were still off 15 minutes after Wayne left, and she became suspicious. She walked over to the station, and there she found her husband lying under a blanket in a back room, and she was shocked to realize he was deceased. It was clear to her that he'd been attacked multiple times with a sharpened blade, and she ran back to the house to call the police. When they arrived, they discovered that Wayne's attacker had been injured in the scuffle that took place, since additional biological material was found in areas other than the back room. Evidence was collected from the scene, but since no one, including Marie, had seen anything, there were no clues to follow up on. The biological material that was collected didn't help the case in any way, since DNA technology hadn't been discovered yet, and before long, investigators had no choice but to admit that they had no idea who Wayne's attacker was, and the case went cold despite many people being interviewed. With the progression of DNA technology and investigative techniques, the case was re-examined in 2011. Evidence that had been collected from the scene was sent to be analyzed, but nothing further would be revealed until 4 years later, in 2015, when it was discovered that the DNA present on the blanket that was used to cover Wayne's body likely belonged to his attacker. But since this was a DNA mixture, it could not be entered into a DNA database, and it seemed as though the case would go cold once again. But notes from interviews conducted at the time showed that the wife of William Dockstader had suspicions that he was the culprit, since she discovered a blade containing biological material shortly after the attack. He was interviewed at the time but could not be named as a suspect, since there wasn't any solid evidence linking him to the crime. He told investigators that he and Wayne were friends and that they didn't have any issues between them. But people who knew Dockstader told investigators that he was struggling financially at the time and that he was on the verge of being evicted from his house. He'd been convicted of stealing gas in the past and was still paying the fines related to that case. If he failed to keep up his payments, he'd be sent back to prison, and hence it was believed that he attempted to rob the gas station, but Wayne put up a fight, and Dockstader ended his life in the process. In 2018, 82-year-old Dockstader was asked to provide his DNA, and in 2023, it was determined that it was his DNA that was found on the blanket. Dockstader was finally identified as Wayne's attacker, but he passed away in 2022, and hence was never charged. Number 1. Melissa Patton spent her childhood growing up in Atlanta, Georgia with her sister Tina. While attending high school, she met Christopher Wolfenbarger, and the two fell in love. After graduating, they decided to get married and eventually had 2 children together. They moved into a duplex in Atlanta, and their lives seemed to be on track, though her family often worried about Melissa, who they described as far too trusting of other people. She was also naive about many aspects of life, but she seemed happy nonetheless. Melissa's family spoke to her on Thanksgiving Day of 1998, and during that conversation, she asked for a Christmas present, a photo of herself with her grandfather. The photo was wrapped and ready for Melissa to open on Christmas Day, when the family would all gather to celebrate the holidays in Locust Grove, Georgia. But on Christmas Day, Melissa failed to show up, and her family tried to contact her but got no answer. When they still hadn't heard from her, a few days later, they decided to drive to Atlanta to check up on her, but they were shocked at what they found there. Upon arriving at the duplex, they realized that the house had been completely cleaned out, and they asked a neighbor what was going on. The neighbor informed them that all of the furniture and items in the house had been removed between Christmas and New Year's Eve. Melissa's mother, Norma, had a birthday on the 24th of February, but once again, they didn't hear from her. They knew something was wrong, and so they contacted the police in 2000 to file a missing person report. when they realized that Christopher had never done so. Christopher was tracked down and questioned, and he explained that Melissa simply decided to leave one day, but he refused to give any further details and would not cooperate with the investigation any further. His criminal history caused investigators some alarm, since he'd been involved with family violence in the past, and several witnesses came forward to report that he'd been abusive towards Melissa at times. But Christopher remained adamant that he didn't know where his wife was and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He stated that he believed she would eventually come home, but never did. He added that she would often work extra shifts at the Waffle House where she was employed, and when she finished late, she would stay over at a hotel rather than travel all the way home. He then revealed that he and Melissa had been talking about moving to California to start a new life, and that she had also created false IDs for them and their kids to do so. When she didn't come home, he assumed that she left without him, and he thought nothing more of it. Then in April of 1999, police officers found human remains in a wooded area close to the glass company where Christopher once worked. They would be identified as Melissa's 4 years later, and thanks to the case being reopened, Christopher was identified as her killer, though investigators have declined to state what evidence led to him being arrested, since the investigation is still open. Christopher was denied bond since he tried to hide behind a dryer from officers, and when they approached him, he tried to flee. He's considered a flight risk as he failed to appear for previous court cases and is currently awaiting trial in the Fulton County Jail. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.